Alright, so if you've been watching my videos long enough, you know that I've been running end-grain cutting boards through my planer. And you also know that usually I explain in my videos why that's a scary thing to do and why you shouldn't do that. So I'm finally going to go ahead and take care of this and make a jig so that I don't have to do that anymore. Even though I've been lucky enough, I've never had one fly apart. I don't want to keep on pressing my luck. So I'm going to make a jig for flattening cutting boards. And I'm also going to make a jig for making a juice groove in my cutting boards. So I'm going to seize the opportunity and I'm going to do a 2-in-1 project. I'm going to make them both the same jig. And we'll see how this goes. Alright, so I'm going to use some MDF as the base for this project. Now when you cut this, it creates a ton of dust. So make sure you're wearing a respirator whenever you cut this stuff up because it is nasty on the lungs. Now instead of making my base out of one layer, I'm going to laminate 2 layers together to make sure it's nice and rigid and stays flat forever. Now, since I used what equates to a stupid amount of glue for this, whenever I put these 2 pieces together, I had a tough time keeping them from slipping back and forth. So what I ended up doing was hitting a pin nail through 2 of the corners to try to keep it held in place. And then I threw a bunch of weights on top of it and let it sit overnight so that it could dry out. Throughout the drying process, the glue did continue to squeeze out through the sides. It was no real big deal or anything, it's just a jig. But if I could do this over again, I would use like a quarter of the amount of glue that I used. The amount that I used was ridiculous. There's no reason for me to have used that much glue, and I should probably go sit in a corner and think about what I did because it was a stupid amount. At this point, I'm cutting out the strips that are going to form the stationary corner that will be mounted to this jig. I'm also cutting out the strips that will be the mobile slides on the left and the top of the jig that will make the jig form to the dimensions of the board that we will be cutting into. Now for the stationary corner, I just glued these strips down. Then I used the pen nailer to make sure that it didn't slip around whenever I clamped and glued it in place. Also used a square to make sure that corner is square. Wasn't as bad as the last time, but again, I probably used a little bit too much glue here. But, you know, too much is better than not enough, I guess, right? Now what I'm going to do is cut out the rails that go around the sides of this jig. Now these rails are going to be what the router rides against as it's cutting out the juice groove. It's also going to be what my flattening bridge slides across on top of whenever I'm flattening a board with this jig too. Okay, so for the next step, I pocket screwed the sides on. Now from the side of my router to the center of the bit is 2 inches. So what I did was I put the sides 1.25 inches away from the edge, which gives me 3/4 of an inch that it goes into the wood. So whenever I put a board in here and start running my juice groove around it, this is where it ends up, right there. and the side of the juice groove should be, depending on the size of the bit that I use, anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 3/8 of an inch away from the edge of my board. Alright, for this I'm going to mark where my moving pieces are going to slide against other pieces. Mark a little bit before it actually starts sliding on those pieces. And I'm going to take it over to the jointer and use the jointer to take a little bit off the bottom so that it has some clearance to slide across each other. Now what I'm doing here is picking out where I want my handles to be. There's nothing special about the measurements I'm making. I'm just trying to make them consistent. But basically what I'm trying to do here is put my handles in a place where I'm not going to rub my knuckles against the side rails whenever I go to make an adjustment to the jig. I would recommend using a piece of scrap underneath your piece so you prevent blowout. Don't do it like I did it, kids. Just use your piece of scrap wood. Now what I've done here is I used my holes that I drilled to draw my lines where I'm going to put my tracks at. And now I'm just double checking with a flashlight to make sure that those holes are following those lines exactly. Now I did put a spacer there because I want a little bit of space between the slider and the sidewall. That way it moves kind of freely and don't bind up on me whenever I'm trying to make adjustments. And then what you do is you measure your track width, divide that by 2, and then measure that far from your line on each side and put another line up there. That way you have your outside lines for the track to fit into, and then just get your router and route that out. This is where that added thickness of 2 layers of MDF came in handy too. It gave me more material to screw my track into. That way I can clamp that down nice and tight and it won't rip my tracks up out of my MDF. Then dust and repeat for the side rails. Now that that's done, I need to work on my flattening bridge. So here we go. I'm going to cut out some of that same 1x4 material and make a box. For making this jig, it's important to get this measurement right. I've gotten this one wrong before. If you remember my keyhole slot jig video, it's a nice embarrassing moment there. But yeah, get that one right. Like a glove on the first try this time. Woohoo! Alright, now I need to cut out a bottom because we're basically building this to be kind of like a drawer, except for the drawer is going to have a nice groove that goes right down the middle of it. So then we'll cut that groove out over here, starting it out on the drill press, and then I'll take a jigsaw and finish the lines down the center of it. So contact with that outer wall like that is something we do not want to have happen. So what I'm going to need to do is go over and cut out some spacers to give my board a little bit of extra room between the board and those outer walls. That way I can have some space to exit the board on each side with that bit so that it don't contact those side rails. Alright, so I have this done here, and we can move this in and adjust it to however long I want the board to be, and then this here can be adjusted to however wide I need the board to be. The sides of this is built to be perfect for the juice grooves. It has just enough space here so that that bit goes right around the edge at the perfect depth to make my juice grooves. But in order to flatten the thing, I need a little more space so that the flattening bit can exit the piece every time. So what I did was I cut some 1 3/4 spacers to give me more room for that. And that should give me the room for this bit to come out of the entire piece. Then there's my bridge. Alright, so I just got done using this for my first board, and unfortunately it did not go without any user error. And I figured we would take a minute here to talk about that so that we can learn from those mistakes together. The first one was whenever I used the flattening bit, I did not tighten all my settings down on my router, and it ended up dropping a little bit, and I ended up having to take an extra 1/4 of an inch of thickness off the board because of that. So yeah, that was a really simple rookie mistake right there. The second one was whenever I was cutting out the juice groove, I started going counterclockwise, and as I was doing that, the blade wanted to kick the router away from my walls here, and I ended up with a little bit of a wavy line there. So I ended up turning it around and going around clockwise, and things went way smoother that direction. Now, in order to fix that wavy line, I ended up just finding a wider bit so I could make a wider juice groove, and whenever I went around it with the wider bit, it straightened up those lines pretty well. So yeah, that's how I fixed that. But overall, I'm really psyched with how this thing turned out. Now I have a flat and juice groove board ready for sanding. Here in about a week or two, I will have the video posted for how to make this board. So if you're interested in that, please hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to let you know whenever I post that video. But yeah, overall, I'm happy how this thing turned out. I think it's going to be a great addition to the shop, and I encourage you guys to make one too.
The cheeks on fire.